and Not to Yield by Alan Villiers. Chapter 1. At Aberdovey, the big black ketch came racing in the squall, the spume flying before her and over her, and the cold wind roaring in her rigging. She was heeled over like a racing yacht, though she was carrying only reefed mainsail, a reefed mizzen, and a storm fore staysail. She was lofty, powerful, and fast, and she fairly tore through the water as the squall passed over her. The outer buoy leaped and jumped in the boiling sea, and the whole bar was a thunder of breakers, so that it was almost frightening to look at it. The wind had been from the north earlier. Now it was from the west, blowing hard and freshening in the squalls. There was still something of the northerly sea running in the bay, and now it converged with the sea racing in from the wild Atlantic, to set up a violent turbulence upon the bar, which was bad enough at any time. The big red recall flag was flying at the little wharf for the boats to come back. The whalers and the cutters that had been at work in the estuary of the Dovey, the bad weather had come up quickly, as it so often did at any port where the North Atlantic was so close outside. The River Dovey flowed down from the hills of Wales into Cardigan Bay, which was nothing but a piece of the Atlantic Ocean, and the ocean and the river had been fighting at the bar for thousands of years, the river to get out, the ocean to get in. "Jeepers creepers now, look at that," shouted a tall lad at the tiller of one of the school's cutters. "Look at that black ketch, fellows. There's sailing." The lads who formed the whaler's crew rested a moment on their oars and watched. The black ketch, still under the same plain sail, had passed the outer buoy and was now shaping a course to come in across the bar, despite the seas which were breaking almost all along it. The entrance into the little port was not so much across the bar as through it. The Atlantic took a great delight in knocking down the arms of sand, which the river water threw up as a sort of protecting arm against its great adversary, and each time a sand bar was knocked down, the river picked it up and deposited it some other place, and so there was such a labyrinth of bars and isolated pieces of sand left behind in the tussle, or waiting to be moved into their proper places, that the sea among them was boiling with anger, spiteful and vicious, as if it was the plaything of some bad-tempered giant. There was a channel through the mess, though if the boys hadn't known it they would never have believed it. The channel ran now this way, now that, along a place where the sea had scoured the sand away, and then across the shallowest part of the bar for a moment, and then again through another hollow, with a piece of the bar one side and another long and untidy arm at the other. Over all this the Atlantic was curling up in great combers, menacing and snarling, and flinging its hungry waters upon all the sands, so that it looked quite impossible for anything to live there, anything, even a fish. To sail through a ship had to remain manageable, with the sea doing its malignant best to fling her either upon the bar or across it and on the sands alee. It looked hopeless. "Aye, lads, better keep her head to tide. It's still flooding, and hang around here a while, case there's corpses to be fished out of this here sea," said a quiet, dark lad in the bows. "Is it as bad as that, Taff? You don't think he'll make it?" The lad, addressed as Taff, stared gloomily at the shrieking water on the bar. The whaler itself was safe enough, for the water was almost still in the river where she was. Taff was a handsome boy, about 16, with regular features and a frank, open face. Now he looked like an old fisherman. "Bar's bad," he said after a while. "No, I don't think he can make it, but if anybody can, he can." In the few seconds, while the boys were watching, the big black ketch was racing at the first of the 3 fairway buoys, which marked the channel. It was impossible to see them all at once, though they were close together. They tore at their moorings with the force of the tide and the hard wind on them until they were lying on their sides. They were supposed to be conical buoys, of a distinctive shape, each bearing its name in white letters, but now they were just bits of black metal that showed now and again, one at a time, in the boiling white water. They served to emphasize the peril of the channel rather than to mark it, but the big ketch was racing fine, up to the first buoy, and past it in a flash, turning a little to windward, then to race on with the spray and the spume flying, and the seas doing their best to send her reeling upon another arm of the bar. Still she raced. A few moments more past the second buoy, another change of course, another leg with the breakers hurling themselves upon her. The lads in the whaler could see a mightier roller than its companions come in from sea, to fling itself upon the bar with all the force and malice of 4,000 miles of Atlantic Sea behind it. Up, up it roared, racing at the ketch. The ketch was close enough for the boys to see a figure in dripping oilskins, bent low over the wheel aft, another in the bows, conning, and a third halfway up the weather main, rigging, whence he pointed and gesticulated, obviously watching for the last buoy. The lads breathed a prayer. Only let the big ketch straighten for the last buoy before that roller caught up with her. Just a moment more. Ketch and roller roared. To seaward, a darkening on the western horizon showed another hard squall coming up from there, with others to follow. The ketch lurched wildly, yawed violently. They saw the figure at the wheel struggling with the spokes. Another figure rushed to slack away more main sheet. Just at that instant the roller caught her. Up, up, up the counter of the ketch was raised like a nightmare steeple chaser, intent on taking the water jump head over heels. Down went her bows, until the water gurgled in the hawse, and the bowsprit was dipping the green sea. Over she lurched, until she looked as if she would capsize, if she was not up-ended. For a second or two she hung there, carried along by the onrush of the wind and the racing of the sea, with her stern up and her bows down, as if the sea was trying to scrape the bottom of the bar with her forefoot, or lift a rudder out of the water to make her unmanageable. Now she was only yards from the inner buoy. The last of the channel, the sea broke. The wall of water seemed to flop down around her, and her counter fell back with a sickening crash that sent her bows flinging out of the sea, until her forefoot showed and her bowsprit pointed to the grey heavens. Alee and aweather the breakers roared and crashed and thundered and snarled, and the roller went dashing into the Dovey to set the whalers dancing there and carry away some pleasure craft from their moorings miles away. The big black ketch came racing in, past the inner buoy, into the river. Woo made it. The watching lads let out a sigh of relief. The ketch was racing at them now. Down mainsail, lively now. They heard the shout as the reefed mainsail aboard. The ketch began to shake and spill, and then to thunder as its folds were loosened, and the lowering gaff brought it down. The ketch raced past them, still running 8 knots and more under only the mizzen and the staysail. The tide, which had been running in 4 knots, was quiet now. It was the top of the tide. For a moment the waters hung their content, or at least locked in armistice, and for a very brief second or so the thunder on the bar was a little quieter, and the clouds of spume and sea smoke rising there did not rise so high. The blackness on the horizon to seaward had lightened too. For the moment no more violent squalls were breeding there. The boys took to their oars to get the whaler back to the jetty. Now the ebb had begun. There was some danger that they might be swept out through the bar channel, out to sea. It had happened. As the ketch raced past, a man aft threw them an end of line to use as a tow rope. The bow lad caught it, took a turn quickly, and the whaler began to race astern of the ketch towards the safety of her berth. Warspite, London, they read on the shapely counter of the big ketch. "Why, that's the ship we're to sail in," said the lad who had first spoken. "Warspite, that's the school's ship. And didn't you know that now?" said the boy called Taff. "Indeed, to goodness, what other ship do you think would come racing in here like that now? Yank. The ketch was under staysail only now. Leggo the line, lads, leggo. I'm fetching up here." An oil-skinned figure shouted to them. They had barely time to cast off the tow rope, when, with her staysail fluttering down and her wet canvas thrashing, the Warspite turned on her heel, and the cable rattled at her bows. She was safely at anchor, a stone's throw from the little wharf, and to seaward the bar smoked and fumed in impotent anger. "She's come in to take the first watch, my sons," said Yank, who was acting as coxswain of the whaler. "I wish it was us, boy. I'm looking forward to a run in that ketch." Chapter 2. The Maintop Watch. The boys in the whaler were the maintop watch of the outward-bound sea school. Let us have a look at them as they bring the whaler smartly to her moorings by the wharf at Aberdovey. They had been together a little less than a week. and like many of the 100 boys on the course, they had come from many different parts of the United Kingdom, and from Europe and beyond. The Outward Bound School was famous, and boys came to it sometimes from the ends of the earth. There were a dozen boys altogether, all dressed in plain blue worsted trousers and blue jerseys, with sea boots and oilskins to keep them dry. Whether they came from the most exclusive schools in England, or had been barrow boys on the London streets 10 days earlier, they were all dressed alike. Actually, 3 of the lads were cadets from well-known school ships, and 2 others had already been to sea. In the bows was a sharp-featured small chap who looked about 12. He was a cadet in the school ship, Conway, and was nearer 16 than 12 years old. His name was Edwards. There was another lad from the Conway who was a month or 2 younger than Edwards, though he was nearly 6 feet tall and well built in proportion. His name was Donaldson, and the boys called him Tiny Donaldson. He was a cheerful lad, with an affable countenance, and arms on him like a young bull's hind legs. He wasn't all brawn and nothing but brawn by any means. Tiny Donaldson had a good head on him, and had already been elected captain of the watch. He was expecting to graduate from the Conway at the end of the term, and was already promised a place as cadet in the Alfred Holt motor ship Caucasus in the China trade, if he had a good report from the Outward Bound, of course. The other cadet was a superior type, or at any rate he tried to look like a superior type, by the name of Lawrence Cholmondeley Jones, which he pronounced Chumley Jones. The boys called him Chum Jones. Attended a nautical training establishment at a place called Pangbourne on the banks of the Thames, and it was only the fact that his prospective employers, the Anglo-Saxon Petroleum Company, insisted that its executive cadets should do a sort of trial run at Aberdovi, which brought him on the course. Chum Jones was going to be a tanker captain as soon as possible, according to himself, well before he was 28, and he regarded the Aberdovi interlude as an unnecessary delay. He was a good chap at heart, and he was fitting in very well with his watchmates. Another of these was an Irish boy, who was an apprentice to some mysterious rite in a great brewery in Dublin. His name was Mike O'Leary, and he was on the course because his employers thought it would help to make the full man out of him, and a breath of the fresh Welsh air would blow away the malt and the hops from the indoor work at the brewery for a while. Mike was a happy-looking chap, with a quizzical face, and a cheerful way of looking at things. His particular mate was a Welsh boy called Taffy Davis, from Nevin in North Wales, who was a galley boy in the Blue Funnel ships, but he was hoping to shift to the deck department the following voyage. He didn't want to be a sea cook. The main toppers were a more than usually assorted collection of maritime and non-maritime youths, even for the Outward Bound. Others in the watch included a hefty young fellow from Iceland, who was in England because his father was something in the Icelandic diplomatic service. The boy's name was Hans Beowulfsson. He was so fair that even his eyelashes were white, so white indeed that they were hardly perceptible. There was a boy from Quito, Ecuador, whose name at the school was Pete, but at home had been born Pedro Henrique dos Santos de Cordoba. Pete was 18, and his father was on a year's business visit to London. Others in the watch were an apprentice from a famous catering firm in London, who went by the name of Curly Matheson, a chap from a metal-working company in Birmingham, whose name was Johnny Shrivenham, but who answered to the name of Brum, and a dark little chap from Manchester, Nicky Sinison. A couple of red-headed lads completed the watch. One of these was Don Wiggins, a farmer's boy from Oxfordshire, and the other was the watch vice-captain, Yank. Yank's name was Harvey Brown, and he was there because his father was top brass in the USAF, someplace in England. Yank went to school at Eton, and this was a month's break to build him up again after an attack of the mumps. Harvey Brown was called Yank on the same principle that Taffy was called Taffy. For every American is a Yank in Britain. It made no difference that he came from Georgia and was not a Yank at all. So they were a dozen lads of all sorts, the only things they had in common being physical fitness, a common age of about 16 to 18, and the plain blue uniform of the outward-bound sea school. Yet it was an extraordinary thing that, though they had been together so few days, and the Meredith scene was new to all of them, already they worked together as a team and liked it. They had settled in amazingly well. Most boys did that, from the early morning shower or dip in the river, whichever was the colder, through the long days of outdoor activities, to a big supper and a good night's sleep at the end. They lived full and happy lives. The few rules of the school bothered nobody. No smoking, the observance of proper training, discipline, self-discipline, under their own elected watch captain and watch vice-captain. They remembered what the warden, an active merchant navy officer, like nearly all the staff, had said at the impressive signing-on ceremony in the big hall. "Lads," he'd said, "I want to welcome you, and I want you to know what you've come to. You're outward bound here." You might wonder just what that might mean. You're outward bound to life, and our month together here is just meant to give you a taste of, well, real living. This is a course for enterprise, adventure, action. We hope you'll find all those things here, but we don't lay them on for you. We can't lay them on for you. We put the school in the surroundings of mountains and sea, where such things belong. We provide the ships and the boats, and the canoes and the mountain trips, and all sorts of real activities, like Coast Guard duty and fire watching, and beach rescue parties. What you get out of it is up to you. We've been called a school of adventure, and perhaps we are that. But the real adventures have to come out of yourselves, out of the self-discovery by you of yourselves. So we're a school for self-discovery, and that's the greatest adventure of all. Maybe some of you won't grasp what I'm talking about, but you'll find out before you leave. What matters here and what matters in living is your own self, and that's all your true self, and the whole point of our sailing and mountaineering and athletics and everything else is to develop that. We've a badge for those who make the grade. It's called the Outward Bound Badge, and I think it's worth having. I hope you'll all qualify. We've a special silver badge for outstanding fellows, but we don't generally award more than 1 or 2 of them a year, and we get 1,000 boys through here in a year. They'd all taken the oath then and signed on. The oath was a simple one. A chap just went up to the ensign-covered table, looked the warden fairly in the eyes, and giving his name, undertook to become a candidate for the badge, to keep all the conditions, and to work in good fellowship throughout the course. The whole thing had grown up in the early days of the Second World War, when far too many seamen's lives were lost in lifeboats because too often the men were accustomed only to work in big ships, where the motion was comparatively slight, the quarters reasonably comfortable, and the work often not actively concerned with real seafaring. They were good crewmen, but they were not always seamen, and they hadn't an idea how to look after themselves or anybody else when they were cast adrift in a small boat on the North Atlantic or anywhere else. So an enterprising Liverpool ship owner and an educationist had begun the sea school to teach young fellows how to muck about in boats. It did so well that it was kept going and indeed extended after the war. Most boys like mucking about in boats, and the school thrived. A boy did not need to want to go to sea to be taken on. All sorts of boys could go to the course, and they were all welcome. There was a watch officer in charge of each watch. He was usually a young merchant navy officer having a brief spell ashore, and none of them stayed at the school very long. There was a constant succession of these young fellows who came straight from the bridges of their ocean-going ships and brought the tang of the sea with them, the real sea, and the real seafaring. When they showed the boys boat work and sailing, it was at once obvious that they were not discussing theory. They knew what they were doing, and the boys responded splendidly. The days sped by, athletics, pulling the whalers, sailing on the broad estuary, turns at Coast Guard duty, scrambling on the cargo nets and the monkey ropes, rigged in the tall trees, lifeboat drill, throwing the javelin, activities such as these filled the hours. The fresh, clean air, the beautiful Welsh scenery, the tang of the Atlantic breezes, and sheer delight in what they were doing made the boys feel fine. The 100 or so lads at the school were divided into 8 watches, and each watch vied with all the others to have its pennant hoisted at the masthead. The watch with its pennant up was that which had done best at the general activities the preceding day. It was amazing how easy and pleasant it was to learn about sailing and map reading when these things were made real. But the highlight of the course, for most of the boys, at any rate, was the run outside in the Irish Sea in one of the ships belonging to the school, the Warspite or the Garibaldi. The watches went in these by turns, roll along our turn in the ketch," said Taffy fervently. "Let's get a crack outside. Maybe you'll regret it when you do go," said Brum Shrivenham. "The Irish Sea isn't every man's cruising ground, you know." "Plenty seasick. Ho, ho, plenty seasick," shouted the lad from Iceland, grinning as if it was a tremendous joke. Chapter 3. Introduction to a Ketch. Before going away as crew of the ketch, each watch was made as proficient as possible by sailing in the estuary. They were also taken down in turns to the wharf to go aboard the ships, and learn the ropes before they would have to use them. The main toppers went down to the wharf the same afternoon that the warspite had come in. The tide was out then, and the two ketches lay far below the level of the wharf planking. The ketches lay on the outside of the wharf, ready to slip away to sea. Inside were two long, tidy lines of all sorts of vessels, between the jetty and the wooden retaining wall of the river, cutters, ships, lifeboats still painted in their wartime gray, sailing dinghies, whalers, and a real coastal lifeboat. This was painted white and green, and it was fitted with the distinctive cork fenders all around the upper part of the hull, and the enclosed, watertight compartments at bow and stern, which were the distinctive feature of the older type of British lifeboat. Ashore, the rows of tall houses, many painted in gay colors, like houses in Italy, lined the road leading to the railway station of Aberdovey, and the hills behind them looked as if they were waiting for a chance to push the whole road full of houses across the sands and into the river. Gulls swooped and called. The little seaside town looked welcoming, as indeed it was. Garibaldi, Liverpool, read Yank on the stern of a husky black ketch, which looked strong enough to sail around Cape Horn. The Garibaldi here is an old French crabber, Mr. McDermott, the watch officer was saying. That means she was built somewhere on a bay of Biscay Beach, and she spent her early life earning her living, with 3 men and a boy aboard, catching crabs and sometimes fish. She has sailed across the North Atlantic many times to the Newfoundland banks, in the days when small sailing ships went across for cod and brought them back in salt. She escaped from France when the Germans overran the country early in the war, and then she was damaged by a firebomb in the Blitz. Then the school got her and fixed her up. She's a good stout old-timer with no pretenses, and she's easy to handle too, except maybe for that windlass there. He pointed to a medieval contraption in the bluff bows, where several turns of a heavy iron cable had been taken round the wooden barrel of a sort of man-size winch, and the cable led back along the deck behind the winch. Now the war spite, Mr. McDermott was continuing, used to be a yacht, so that's why you can see at a glance that she's a much slimmer and apparently faster vessel. But she isn't so much faster than the Garibaldi as all that. It's the shape of the ship under the water that really matters, you know, and the Garibaldi is sleek and slippery enough there. Her old bows are like a fish's. They part the water easily and offer little resistance. She can get along The Warspite once belonged to the Royal Naval Yacht Squadron, but she's earned her living through the two big wars, and she's earning her living again now. Aye, that she is, Mr. McDermott. Good day to you," called up a cheerful voice from her teak decks in accents which even Yank could recognize as heavy Welsh. "Ah, Mr. Hughes, good day to you. Are you ready for another watch?" "Aye, that we are. Be so good now, bring them down." The boys clambered down the main rigging of the big ketch, jumping the last few feet carefully onto the decks. Yank found himself aboard a thoroughbred of a ship, which was even more attractive from her decks than she had been when seen from the pier above. Her teak work gleamed, and her brass glinted in the sun, and the wheel aft and the tall spars were invitations to sail to anywhere. "Here's a part of the course I can take, hands down," said Yank to Taffy, who looked a little dubious about it. "Aha, it's seasick I'll be. I'm not used to a vessel like this." "You get used to it fast. She's a honey. I'd like to see her in the Bermuda race." Yank was enthusiastic. He was sizing up the rig with an experienced eye, following the lead of the gear, and sniffing at a pleasant odor of coffee which was coming through the skylight. The boys grouped around Mr. Hughes. The mate of the Warspite, and listened to him as he expounded on the gear, while Mr. McDermott went down below to get a little closer to that coffee. Beginning in the bows, Mr. Hughes worked his way aft, showing and explaining everything, so that even the lad from Birmingham, who'd never been near any sort of a ship in his life, soon felt almost at home. The sails were all in their places, but secured, and the Warspite was ready to sail at 5 minutes' notice. Mr. Hughes explained how the sails were loosed and set with halyards and sheets, and how the rigging all did its work. First he showed everything, then he had the boys do things for themselves, 2 at a time, to loose the staysail and the jib, and then the others to set them. Then they hauled the sails down again and furled them properly, not just a fishwife's bunched up laundry. After that the whole watch set the big mainsail by hauling on the halyards, peak and throat, until the varnished gaff swayed high aloft. Some went to one side and some the other, and Mr. Hughes, who seemed to have an eye for such things, immediately grabbed the 2 Conway boys and Chum Jones to tend the lifts, where the canvas could be chafed and damage done if things were not set properly. Yank went to the head of the throat halyards, which was another post of responsibility, and he soon showed that he too knew his way about a vessel. They set the mainsail, and lowered it again, stowing the big sail thoroughly, making the canvas up neat and trim with a fine outer skin on it. "Things have got to be done right aboard here," Mr. Hughes was saying. "Now that skin there, you'll wonder why I'm such an old fuss pot now. Couldn't you all just bundle up the canvas and get the gaskets around it? The gaskets are those lines you're putting round the sail, but you cannot do things like that, leave a fold of canvas showing to a gale, and the whole cell blow out on you in a half a minute. No, no, my lads, thorough's the word. You'll be crew here one day soon. Now you mark my words, my sons, and learn while you may, for she'll be jumpin' and leapin' once she gets outside that bar, and half of you'll be feedin' the fishes." The boys heeded him, and they were willing pupils. If anyone told me back in Brum, even last Saturday, that I'd be pullin' my guts out aboard a boat like I am now, why, I'd a laughed my guts out at 'em. "Indeed I would," said the Birmingham lad, Johnny Shrivenham. "Funny thing, it's work, but you don't mind it." And he jumped from halyard to halyard, and down haul to sheet, and lift tackle at the mate's bidding. So did the others, and Chum Jones was overheard to remark that it was a jolly good show, chaps, no fewer than 17 times, even before they all trooped down below to look at the quarters there, and have a brew of tea. By that time they felt that they had a real idea of how the sails were set and controlled. The Warspite was as neat and compact below as she was seamanlike and ship-shape on deck. As Mr. Hughes said, there was a place for everything, and everything in its place, and stayed there unless it was being used. Every single thing was obviously designed to remain where it was, and to perform its proper function, even if the ship were standing on her head. From the 12-bunk forecastle forward there was a high-sided pipe, cot for each boy, to the little engine room, and the sail locker aft. The ship was a model of neatness and utmost use of space. Next to the forecastle came the saloon, a pleasant cabin done in white and gold, with old-fashioned plush seats along each side, and a neat array of sideboards, lockers and shelves, with a big skylight overhead bringing in the sunshine and the air, and 2 small ports on either side, which were very securely fastened. Off this saloon, on the port side, was the galley, and they all took a look in there. Brightly polished pots and pans hung from a deck head, which also sprouted outsized mugs and coffee pots, and all the plates and utensils were stowed in lockers, so contrived that even if the ship fell over, those plates would stay where they belonged. The stove itself was a patent one, in bright chromium and enameled metal, made by famous makers who advertised that their stoves could cook at all hours and were most economical with fuel. Taffy, the galley boy, and the apprentice from the London caterers were greatly taken with the cooking arrangements. "I wouldn't mind having a go in there," said Curly Matheson, admiration in his eyes. "Well, maybe you'll get your chance," said Mr. Hughes. "A boy each watch does the cooking, indeed now, but it's few we ever get that can do the job, or want to." 2 long wooden tables took up most of the saloon, for all hands ate in there, the regular crew of the Warspite, which consisted of no more than 3 men, the master, who was away just then, the mate, and another Welshman, who ran the engine, and helped to run the ship when the boys were not aboard, and the boys themselves. Yank gathered that the idea of carrying so few men was to ensure that the boys not only formed the real crew, but felt they did, even though they might be aboard only a few days. Also, in the saloon were some photographs of a big Cape Horn ship, which the mate was very proud of. "Yes, I've sailed in ships like that," he admitted in response to questions. Across one white bulkhead ran a motto, picked out in letters of gold. Yank read what it said: "To serve, to strive, and not to yield." The boys milled about, filling and overfilling the saloon. They clambered up the companion, which reached the main deck, through the little deck house, where there was a bunk for the master, some fire extinguishers, an axe, and a standard compass. Abaft the saloon were the cabins, where the officers slept. Behind these, the engine room, and the sail locker. In the engine room was a little man with a large engine all in pieces, and the little man was muttering to himself in Welsh. At least, Yank asked if it were Welsh. "Welsh," said Taffy. "It is Welsh indeed. Wild Welsh that man is talking. He doesn't seem to be very pleased with something. The engine, I'm thinking now." "Well, she can sell," said Yank. "She'll need to, my boy, with this misuse of old metal that's called an engine down here," the little man shouted up. "But I'm not knowing what's to get her out across the bar. Engine, is it?" He spluttered into Welsh again. "If she ever needs that in a hurry, she's going to need a good crew," was Yank's summary of the mechanical situation, after a good look at the engine, which he thought must have been one of the first marine engines installed afloat. Mr. McDermott, coming up at that moment, quite agreed. It was not the Warspite's engine that got her anywhere, he said, but its function was merely to help her a little now and then, to see she kept her schedule, and was able to get all the boys to sea. With 8 watches and a month only for all to go out, the ketches would have to be off the bar every 3 or 4 days to embark a fresh watch. As the boys formed up and swung along the road again, bound for the big house among the hills, which was their school, and the Welsh boys led in song, Yank found himself thinking about the Warspite and the sail they were to have out in the Irish Sea, and through his mind continually ran the words of that motto he'd read in the saloon, like the chorus of an endless song: "To serve, to strive, and not to yield." Aye, she'd call for service, if it blew up a gale, and she looked the sort of ship that would not yield. Chapter 4. Out in the lifeboat. The following days, for many of the boys, were the most interesting, and in a curious sort of way, the most satisfying that they had ever spent. From the tingling cold shower at crack of dawn, and the morning run, until the time they fell into their bunks by night, life was full, fit, and stimulating. Cobwebs were swept away in the keen Welsh air, swinging up the monkey ropes, and along the taut mooring line became almost child's play, sailing on the estuary of the Dovey, in the ship's lifeboats, pulling the whalers, making bicycle and foot trips into the hilly hinterland, and going for scrambles on the lesser mountains. These were interspersed with sessions of necessary lectures, all to do with the practical stuff of the outward bounder's course: boat knowledge, rule of the road at sea, local conditions, which could be fierce and dangerous, map reading, simple pilotage, the theory of sailing, a bit of compass work, and sea terms. There were lectures on all these. Yank began to feel that he had been a member of maintop watch all his life, and so did the others. The cycle trips in the hills, the commando runs on the mountain sides, getting a heavy boat aground on one of the many sandbanks in the estuary and getting her off again, doing his turn at the Coast Guard lookout. It was a real Coast Guard station, and the boys helped to man it, or taking his turn at fire watching. It was all enjoyable. Every possible moment was spent afloat. Sometimes there were wild days when westerly or southwesterly gales blew right into the river, and a tremendous sea broke on the bar, which no ship could stand, and all the beaches along by Borth and north past Towen were a maelstrom of white water and swirling sea, and the wind howled about the little wharf, as if it wanted to blow the very rail tracks from it. On such days there could be no sailing, but there was always seamanship to be learned in the comparative comfort of the big shed, with its fascinating array of sea gear, anchors, masts, and yards, cordage and grapnels of all sorts and sizes, a brace of varnished dinghies, a carpenter's shop, where a wizened Chinese from a blue funnel ship made blocks and repaired woodwork, a big sail loft, and pervading everything, that most satisfying odor of Stockholm tar and marline stuff that reeks of the real sea. An old Welsh boatswain ruled the shed. He was a taciturn ancient with keen blue eyes, shaggy great eyebrows, of the same fair shade as the Icelanders, and long whiskers growing from his cheeks, which looked tough enough to pull out and use as nails. His gnarled old fingers had the strength of marline spikes, and his very breath seemed to smell of Stockholm tar. When he was in a good mood, which was not always the case, the boatswain regaled the boys with yarns of the local sailing ships, the brave schooners from the Dovey and the little clippers from Port Madoc up the bay. He'd spent a lifetime in Portmadoc ships, carrying slates around the world, taking salt from Spain to Newfoundland, and bringing salted codfish back to Greece and Italy. He spoke of the little ships as if they were persons, and to him Port Madoc was the center of the universe. Now his contempt for a sea full of powered vessels was so great that he rarely went away from the wharf, except to sail in the New Quay lifeboat. In his deep blue eyes there was always the image of some lovely bark, like the Pride of Wales, or brave little Western Ocean schooner like the Blodwen, and her kind. The disappearance of such ships from a heedless world he put down entirely to the machinations of the appalling English, who had, he said, built up great steamship lines and hogged the trade of the world until there wasn't as much as 100 tons of slates or a hold full of codfish that a brave Welsh schooner could carry anywhere. Ah, those English! The old man spoke English as if he resented having to use the language, and he used every possible Welsh word and Welsh name that he could. He flatly refused even to speak of the Dovey or Aberdovey. The river was the Dyfi and the town Aberdyfi to him, but it was on the fascinating history of the Dovey itself, or his version of it, that the boys loved to hear the old boatswain talk. He needed a crony or two from the Cape Horners or the Portormodoc ships really to bring him out on his own seafaring days, and such cronies were scarce. Roman ships came here, boys, he'd say, and ships from the great Spanish Armada, and ships with the saints from old Ireland, and the great Celtic sailors knew this port and the way beyond the bar. Aye, and the way across the Western Ocean, too, long years before any Italian ever passed that way. It is Welsh that land America ought to be, for it was Welshmen that first sailed there. He never produced the evidence on which he based this claim, but no one contradicted him. He was on sure ground with his stories of the Roman ships, and the Roman camps and roads, and the Armada ships, and the pirates. There were lead mines all round here, and plenty of cargoes for the ships from the Tiber and the Thames. He'd go on, and great patriots of Wales came here to hold their assemblies and muster their men. There on Borth Sands across the river, it is called the Traeth Melgwyn. To this day, the warriors met. There was no Norman conquest here in Wales, you know. It was here that Cadwgan and Owen took ship for Ireland to hide a while until it was time to come back and bloody the English nose again. 100 sailing ships and more sailed right out of this same Aberdyfi now, and the half of 'em were built here, right near where you're all a-sitting, and the fisheries were enormous. It was great times indeed. It was great times. The old boy's voice would trail off as if he were still listening for the rallying shouts of the men of Cadwagan. And Owen, or harking to the sigh of the trade wind in an outward bound bark's rigging, Yank felt himself transported back 1,000 years. Who on earth Cadwagan and Owen might have been he didn't know, but Taffy told him they were great heroes of Wales. When it came to getting the lifeboat ready for a run to sea, the boatswain did not spend time in reminiscences. This was the last pulling and sailing lifeboat in Britain, and it had been given to the school when the New Quay boat was replaced by a power-driven vessel. Only when conditions were such that the boys could be brought up quickly to a high pitch of efficiency, or the weather remained particularly good throughout the course, was it customary for the big lifeboat to go outside. She was a difficult craft to handle for any but her old regular crew. She was sailed with a rig which was rather awkward for novices, and her oars were long sweeps, rather beyond the power of a boy. The main toppers were delighted when Tiny Donaldson told them they had been selected to take the lifeboat for a run outside the bar. Even the old boatswain almost approved of the main-top watch. The boys were mostly big lads, and the watch included more than the usual proportion of youths who came to the school with some sea training already behind them. They were just the group to handle that lifeboat. The old man himself, the warden, was always called that took charge, with Mr. McDermott, the watch officer, along with him, and the boys took a day's food and a blanket apiece, in case they were unable to return the same day. Once you took a ship through the Dovey Bar, unless you came more or less straight back in again on the same tide, there was no knowing when you might be able to sail in again, and the lifeboat needed quite a depth of water to float her, even with her center boards hauled up. By this stage, the boys were so accustomed to the sailing precautions that they took them as a matter of course. All wore sea-going life jackets of varying patterns, and these were adjusted before they got into the boat and pushed off from the wharf. They went out on the top of the tide, going down the estuary under oars. The passage through the bar began only about half a mile from the wharves, and they had to be ready for it. At slack water, the lifeboat approached the bar rapidly. The boys pulled like experts, which was more than they had done at the beginning of the course. The orders by now had a familiar ring, even to the lad from Birmingham. Fix stretchers, ship crutches, oars ready, toss oars down, give way together. And off went the graceful white and green boat like a swan, while the boys lifted their eyes now and again to admire the loveliness, yet once more, of the setting of the little seaside town. It was a gem of a place on a day like this, with the sun shining and the wind quiet. The estuary was a broad, silvered sheet, with the river at high water, and all the sands were covered for an hour or two. The big iron refuge stood up incongruously, like a raft on stilts, and the port seemed to have acreage enough to anchor a fleet of liners. But there was still a roaring on the bar where the breakers were. "Conical buoy ahead, sir," shouted young Edwards, on the lookout, and another buoy, and another came into view, jumping in the swell. Now they were in the channel among the sandbanks of the bar, and Yank wondered how the old topsail schooners and brigs and barkentines were able to negotiate the place. The channel led first this way, then that, going right between long lines of sandbanks, which even at the top of high water glinted yellow and white so close by. In places the channel could be wide enough barely to allow a ship to pass without touching the bank. For a stretch of about a quarter of a mile it led actually between two lines of sandbanks, with the sea making over them and the swell coming from the southwest, causing a set on to the inshore bank, to the grave peril of large vessels without ample power. In the channel itself there was a smooth area, but this was only comparative. Before the boat was halfway through, the tide was racing on the ebb, and the breakers set up a sullen roar as they felt the opposition. Soon the boat was tossing like a piece of jetsam in a surf, and the old man at the tiller was having his work cut out to keep the lifeboat to her course. Handsomely, my boys, handsomely, all together, now, backs into it. Mr. McDermott himself was stroke, pulling as if he loved it, and the old Welsh boatswain had joined young Edwards on lookout in the bow. To some of the lads, with the dancing of the boat, and the great exertion, for a moment or two, Aberdovey itself seemed to be dancing too, and the line of high houses did a crazy hornpipe against the blue and green hills. Now the stern of the boat rose high as the tide raced past, and the water swirled angrily at the channel-marking buoys, and the roar of the breakers was menacing and constant. Handsomely, lads, not far to go now. The old man was smiling, eyes puckered up, an expression almost of exultation on his face, showing his delight to be handling a sleek boat and a good crew, bringing her out into the open sea from the confines of the land. Buoy 1, buoy 2, buoy 3 rushed past, and the boat leapt in a tumble of foam. Once a great comber, like a Cape Horn sea, swept at her, and seemed determined to crash into her, bringing her to permanent grief. But she rose like an albatross upon the breast of the sea, and took the wall of green water in her stride. That's it, my lads, that's the way. Keep good way on her, keep her going. A few of the boys were feeling somewhat green about the bows themselves, for it was the first time they had made the passage through the bar, and felt the violent motion there. But the keen, fresh air and the fine sea wind, filling young lungs, and the delight in good teamwork, kept them from the more active forms of seasickness, at any rate, for the moment. "Ah, there's the fairway buoy now," said Mr. McDermott, as a buoy with a top mark, larger than the rest, came into his field of vision abeam. Almost at once the motion quietened. The boat was through the passage and over the bar, the long lines of green water flinging themselves, one behind the other like marshalled lines of watery hills, massed to attack the land, were not half so menacing when seen from the seaward side. Line after line of water which approached the coast quietly until it felt the challenge of the bar, rose into long walls, up and up and up, curling and snarling, to hurl themselves upon the land of Wales, as if they wanted to wash it all away. Oars, came the warning. Toss oars. A dozen long oars leapt aloft, wet blades glinting in the sun, and the water dripping. Unship crutches, boat oars. The long oars came inboard, to be stowed neatly and securely fore and aft, out of the way of the sailing gear. Already the lifeboat was clear of the disturbed water round the Dovey bar. There was a gentle breeze from the west-southwest, and the mast had been stepped before they left the wharf. "Well, give her her canvas and go for a sail," said the old man. "Just the day for it, too," he added with satisfaction. It was not until the sails were hoisted aloft and set with perfection on the two stout masts that the boys had time to sit down for a moment and notice the view. The lifeboat slipped along effortlessly and almost upright, the blue water of Cardigan Bay lapping at her white sides, and the blue sky above looking as if it never had been any other color, and never would be again anything but a glorious Mediterranean blue. The boat sped northwards about a mile or so from the land, which came down to the water there in a sweep of sandy beach, with a railroad at the back of it, and beyond that the mountains of Wales. Yank had never seen North Wales from the sea before. The old boatswain just sat in the bows, staring at it. The glorious valleys and the beautiful mountains made a perfect scene. Away in the northwest, the horn of the wide bay was lost in the haze of Bardsey Island, where the saints of Wales were buried. To the north, on the starboard bow, was Great Snowdon, highest mountain of them all. Just forward of the starboard beam was Cader Idris, looking like a gentle mound of the land of Wales, lifted up to feel the life-giving warmth of the sun. Yank stared and stared. He'd heard of the Bay of Naples, of Rio de Janeiro, even of the beauty of the distant Bay of Islands in New Zealand, where his father went fishing once. But why had no one ever told him of this lovely Cardigan Bay of Wales? The place was perfect. That's Bird Rock up there now, boy, and the Welsh there now, and Corlin Fraith, and Terranquam Furthernum yonder, town you're seein'. By the foreshore there is Cowan, and to the north of that comes Barmouth. You'll be seein' Crysith, and Crysith Castle, and Harlech Castle, and all the grandest hills of Wales before the day's done. He lapsed into Welsh poetry, and Taffy the galley boy took up the refrain, until Chum Jones put a wrench in the proceedings by suddenly sitting up and shouting that it was a jolly good show, and absolutely a wizard backdrop. "Jolly good show," said the old boatswain. "I'll have you to know it's no show you're looking at. That's Wales, and him with the good name of Jones," the old man muttered, looking sadly at the boy, as if he failed to comprehend how anyone with the good Welsh name of Jones could have become such an Englishman. The lifeboat sped along before the slowly freshening breeze, while the day continued perfect, and almost every moment brought fresh vistas of the beautiful coast. They passed the Bwyche buoy, and if the name had not been painted on it in very large letters, Yank wouldn't have had the faintest idea how to spell it or pronounce it. They passed by Barmouth and high Cader Idris, well inland. It looked a mighty mountain to run up, as Curly Matheson remarked, and then stood away from the land to round the end of the causeway, that long arm of rocks that reaches into Cardigan Bay. "It's all drowned land around here," said the boatswain, whose version of history was always picturesque, if not wholly accurate. Yon causeway was the stone wall of a Welsh landowner in these parts, and the sea rushed in one day and took his fields. The fishermen out of Pwllheli fish up strange things to this day, though some say the rocks got up in the sea for the saints to walk on to Ireland. Whether the causeway was a rockway for saints, or the drowned wall of some ancient Welsh giant's field. Yank didn't know, but the water boiled around it, even on that fair day. And here and there eddies raced, and the sea showed a swirling surface, indicating a profusion of foul bottom close below. On one place were the remains of a steel ship. The old man gave the buoy a good berth. Causeway, it said, as if everybody reading it would know which causeway it was. It was a larger buoy than the others, and a bell clanged slowly and mournfully on it as it rolled slightly in the sea. A large cormorant looked disdainfully at the lifeboat as it sped past, and the boatswain shouted at it. An hour or so more, and the boat was dancing past St. Tudwall's roads, with the horn of Ch1-5 and all the Nevin peninsular aweather. Now it was Taffy's turn to grow lyrical, for he was born at Morfanevin, round the corner, after a vain but moving endeavour to rhapsodize on the history, beauties, and paramount perfection of all North Wales. Taffy and the old boatswain lapsed first into Welsh, then into song, and then finally into the eloquent silence. Indeed, it was all a lovely place on such a day, seen from the silent and graceful little vessel. Past St. Tudwall's eastwards they spun, the boys taking turns at the tiller under the old man's eye, while Mr. McDermott and Curly handed out the lunch. Lunch consisted of great slabs of brown bread, with corned beef between, fishermen's slices, the old man called them, none of your ladylike stuff, and all hands fell on them with a will. Yank could hardly manage to stretch his mouth wide enough open to get one in. He ate 7. The boat sped along, past the beach at Pwllheli, past Crycheth and its ancient castle ruins, towards the bar off Portmadoc, where the old boatswain waved his ancient cap 3 times in salute. He said to the great ships, which had come bounding out of there, a roll of foam at the cut waters, and the song of the wind in their rigging, all the world at their bows. All this time the old man, Mr. McDermott, and the boatswain were busy pointing out landmarks, explaining the lay of the land, giving details of the worth of ships, or lack of it, of the various small ports, the holding ground at St. Tudwall's roads. I've seen 20 sailing ships there myself, wind-bound, all waiting for a slant, and the gay sight when they were all off, sang the boatswain. The depths of Pwllheli Bar, the anchorage of Crycheth, all were pointed out and duly noted by at least those among the boys who intended going to sea. Yank was as attentive as everyone. He declared his intention, when he'd make some dough, of bringing his own ship over to these waters, and going cruising himself. The old man had a chart spread on the after thwart, and they all pored over it. We'll make a swing around Tremadoc Bay, and have a look at Harlock, and then home for the Dovey Bar, the old man announced, as the afternoon wore on, for it was a long sail. We'll see how the weather is. It looks settled enough. What d'ye say, boatswain? Aye now, good enough, and I'm thinkin' it'll turn to the east'ard next. Gives 3 days of that, and we'll have 3 weeks. If it stays good, we'll keep under way, or put a grapnel down for the night somewhere off Barmouth, or maybe under the hills between Towan and the Dovey, the old man declared. The evening found them under the grim square castle of Old Harlech. "Doesn't your blood sing here?" shouted the old boatswain, breaking into "Men of Harlech" in a very loud voice. The breeze dropped a little, though the boat still had good way. The evening was perfect. There were plenty of fishermen's slices left to provide an ample supper, washed down by water. At 9 o'clock, watches were chosen. 3 watches with the old man, Mr. McDermott, and the boatswain in charge, and their petty officers were Tiny Donaldson, Yank, and Tich Edwards. Yank's crowd had the Gravy Eye watch from 4 a.m. When it was dark, towards half after 10, the lads not on watch rolled into their blankets, with their oilskins above them, the bottom boards of the old lifeboat for bunk, and the stars for covering. "This is the life," thought Yank, as he fell into deep and untroubled sleep, and the lapping of the waters on the planking was a lullaby. 2 boys kept lookout in the bows. Another had the tiller under the eye of an officer, and the 4th was stand by. To them all the old lifeboat was like a Portmadoc clipper reborn, and the high stars seemed to reach down to kiss her mast, the soft black night to hide from her a harsh world beyond the horizon, in which she no longer belonged. To steer, to keep lookout across the dark waters, to listen to the sighing of the gentle wind, to watch the flow of the graceful sails as they imparted way to the shapely hull. To do any of these things was to feel a share in the adventures of the illustrious past. Men of Harlech, men of Portmadoc, men of all the Nevin Peninsula, warriors and sailors, their ghosts arose from an adventurous past, and sailed through the night with the old lifeboat, with her freight of youth outward bound for life and the deep sea. Chapter 5. Joining the Warspite. In the soft grayness of a lovely morning, the boat came back to Aberdovey, and passed through the Bar Channel at half tide, with a minimum disturbance. It was always easier to go in than to come out. It had been nothing but a simple sail, yet it had also been a memorable adventure. Everyone from the old man down was delighted with it. "I wish we could get in a run like that with every watch," the boys heard the old man saying to Mr. McDermott. But that Cardigan Bay he broke off, with a look astern at the waters, which were quiet just then, but very often were not. "Now, my lads, it's the Warspite for you next, isn't it?" "Aye, sir, it's our turn next," said Tiny Donaldson, with pleasure in his voice. "I'm expecting her in tonight, or tomorrow morning. You'll have to join her off the bar. She can't get in with these neaps." Even the most abject landsmen among the boys knew well what neaps were, for the neap tides did not bring water enough upon the bar to allow the Warspite or the Garibaldi to sail in. The ketches needed about 11 feet of water to float in, at least, and that meant that there should really be 13 feet on the bar to let them come in safely, for the rise and fall of the seas on a gentle day would take 2 feet of water. Sometimes there would be 15 feet to float them, and sometimes 11, which was the bare minimum. So when the tides were low, they did not try to come in, for fear of pounding or worse. Instead, the watches went out in a big cutter, sometimes towed by Ellis Williams, with his fine motor boat, sometimes under their own power, and they jumped aboard the ketches as they lay hove to outside, according to accounts which other watches had brought back. That could be a lively experience. Next morning, sure enough, the lads on Coast Guard duty called early to announce that the Warspite could be seen making for the outer buoy off the bar. Tiny and Yank had the watch ready. Orders were to take a minimum of gear, their blankets, their oilskins, and food enough for 5 or 6 days. Chum Jones' idea of a minimum of gear consisted of every single thing he possessed, and he had come to the school armed with a portable typewriter, a portable gramophone, and 2 cameras. He'd been told that it was a good idea for a shipmaster to be expert on the typewriter. He explained in answer to Mr. McDermott's amused queries. The officer had to admit that maybe the lad was right, so the portable typewriter went along. The others managed with a sea bag between each pair of them. Even so, by the time all 12 and their gear and food and the Warspite's other requirements, such as a few bags of galley fuel and some spare cordage, were all piled into the boat, she was fairly full. Ellis Williams towed them to the bar, with Mr. McDermott in charge of the boat. By now, the buck-jumping and switchback riding of the boat in the breakers was familiar. The boys had the oars ready in case the tow line parted. Once the boat took a wild sheer when she was passing through that part of the channel where the send of the breakers was right across it, and she touched on the sand once or twice. Ellis soon had her off and on her way. Aboard the Warspite, which was dipping and rolling so that half her copper bottom showed alternately on each side, they could see the boys of the watch they were relieving, the foretop shouting and waving as they approached. The big ketch was not at anchor, but keeping slow way with her mainsail run down in its gear and the mizzen and big forestaysail set, giving her a speed through the water of perhaps a couple of knots. The lads hanging over the side looked extremely pleased with life, though up in the bows one little boy still hung over the rail with his face very green and no delight on his countenance whatever. A section of the bulwarks on the lee side had been removed to provide easy access to the decks, and as the boat approached this, the boys saw the deck was piled high with sea boots and sea bags and bundles of oil skins, which the departing watch was taking off with them. Now the boat was alongside, and the transfer began. It was strange how at once the motion of both boat and ketch seemed to increase tenfold, making everything difficult. Immediately the scene was one of intense activity. Blue-jerseyed boys scrambled aboard the ketch, and more blue-jerseyed boys scrambled into the boat out of the ketch. Sea bags and everything else whizzed through the air as the boat jumped and the ketch rolled, until Yank couldn't for the life of him understand how things would ever come clear, and he half expected that, when the transfer was complete, the watches would be mixed up frantically, and all the wrong gear would be in the ketch. But he soon saw that there was a very real order to the apparent confusion. Mr. Hughes, the mate, knew how to handle this situation, which was old stuff to him. All the outgoing gear was on the port side of the ketch, grouped neatly by the deck house, and all the incoming gear was flung at once across, clear to the starboard side, so there could be no confusion. Indeed, not as much as a nut of anthracite or an Irish potato was dropped or mislaid. The watch captain of the watch, being relieved, had a good grip of his boys too, and the right group of lads descended into the boat. All this took about 3 minutes. Mr. McDermott saw to it that the gear in the boat was properly stowed for the run in through the breakers again, and Ellis Williams was back alongside in the twinkling of an eye to tow the boat. The main toppers each gave their life jackets to the lads going in, and took life jackets from them for use in the ketch. In less than 5 minutes since the boat came alongside, she was off again, the 4 toppers giving the main toppers a good cheer of farewell. "Hoist the mainsail," was the order aboard. Yank found himself at the wheel, while the other boys, under the keen eye of the mate, went to the foot of the mainmast, and took hold of the throat and peak halyards there. The mate was everywhere at once, tending the sheet, seeing the lee lift was slack so the wire would not chafe through the canvas, and the weather lift taut to support the boom, encouraging the boys, seeing the gaff went aloft swift and clear. The boys hauled with a will, a Conway lad at the head of each line, while the Warspite fell away on her course and began to steady, with the greater area of canvas to keep her listed in the growing breeze. "Steer northwest 3/4 west," said the captain to Yank. "Know the compass, lad?" "Aye, aye, sir, northwest 3/4 west," repeated Yank, in the approved manner, like an ancient mariner, and with a spoke or two he brought the ketch to her course. The wheel was light and easy, and she obviously handled like a witch. "Have you been at sea, then?" asked the captain when Yank's turn was over. "I've been on a Bermuda race, sir," said Yank. The captain looked at him. Though he had been at sea all his grown life, the captain had only a vague idea as to what the Bermuda race might be. He seemed to recollect that it was a hard affair, of slogging a group of small yachts from somewhere on the eastern seaboard of the United States down to the island of Bermuda, across the Gulf Stream, and through all sorts of adverse conditions, driving the yachts night and day, and making what was often a very difficult landfall at the end. He had a deal of wondering admiration for anyone who would deliberately seek a tough piece of sailing like that, and call it sport. Bermuda race, was it tough, he asked. Not too bad, sir. The fast net can be worse. Been in that too? Only once, sir, but I'm hoping to crew again this year. The old captain took a quizzical look at the red-haired lad. As an old sailing ship sailor himself, he was glad to know of these ocean-going yachtsmen who kept the spirit and the art of sailing alive. The captain was a gray-headed man, grown old in the service of great cargo liners, in the trade to China and Japan, and down to Australia. The Warspite was by far the smallest vessel he had ever been in his life, by at least 1,000 tons. He'd begun his sea career at the turn of the century in a shapely little Scots bark. All her sort were dead and gone long since, but he had qualified in them. He was glad he had, for it had served him in good stead throughout his long career, and through 2 world wars. His reflections on this subject were cut short by the mate's report that everything was secure, and all things in order, the boys' gear stowed down below, and the 12 bunks properly allocated. This was done by the watch captain, Tiny Donaldson. Not all the bunks were alike, not even of the same length. They all had the main requirements for a tolerable rest at sea in a small vessel. They were fore and aft, that is, along the line of the keel, and they had high sides to keep the boys in if the ship rolled violently, as she certainly would. "Muster the watch, Mr. Hughes," said the captain. "Muster aft, boys. Life jackets on." The boys made their way to the open space by the wheel, some of them staggering a bit, for the Warspite had a big deck, with room enough to throw them off balance. It was different in the lifeboat, where they had to stay where they were. In the ketch, there was room to walk. They had to find their sea legs. The captain stood aft where all the boys could see him, and explained to them briefly a few necessary things about the running of the ship. They would, he said, be divided into 2 sections, to be called the port and starboard watch of the ketch, the port under the vice-captain and the starboard under the watch-captain. The boys were the crew of the ship, and there was no other crew. He relied on them, and so did the ship. There were a few simple rules to be borne in mind, such as no talking to the boy at the wheel, no crowding on deck, and no unnecessary congregating abaft the mizzen-mast. Fresh water to be used sparingly, no ports to be opened, because of the danger of swamping even in good weather, and so on. The captain explained each of these rules, and why it was necessary. Then he took the boys over the vessel and showed them the fire-fighting gear, the pumps, the spare sails, and once again the running rigging. Then they were divided into the 2 sections, which were as follows: port, yank, taffy, Titch Edwards, Pedro de Cordoba, Pete, Curly Matheson, Chum Jones, Starboard, Tiny Donaldson, Hans the Icelander, Mike O'Leary, Johnny Shrivenham, Brum from Baham, Nicky Senusian, Don Wiggins. This made 2 well-balanced teams. Now we'll take a first sail up to Abersosh, and we'll put her through her paces a bit, so you'll get the hang of things on the way, the captain concluded. We'll probably put the anchor down in St. Tudwall's Roads for the night. You boys had a long day yesterday, and you'll have a longer tomorrow, for we'll be away at first light, and make a long board down to the Tusker, or maybe run through Bardsea Sound and make across for the Codling or the Kish light ship, and sail around them and back again, or perhaps into Dunlunghair by Dublin if the conditions are good. We'll be out a couple of nights then, so we'll take it a little easy today, and you'll get a rest this night, I hope. We'll have sandwiches on the way to St. Tudwall's, and a good hearty meal when we get in. There'll be anchor watch tonight from 6 to 6, each boy an hour, watch captain to draw lots and report names to the mate. Now do you all understand everything? Yes, sir, came the chorus. Fine then, Mr. Hughes. We'll begin instruction at the wheel. Each boy in turn came to do a trick at the wheel, steering the ketch under her full suit of sails. She was running easily, making about 5 or 6 knots, but poor Birmingham, and 1 or 2 others had a bit of a job at first to decide which way to put the wheel when the ketch got a little off course. Old Brum, for the life of him, couldn't get the idea, and tried to bring the lubber's point back to the compass course he was supposed to be steering, with the result that the ship got more and more off course. But Mr. Hughes saw she did not take a complete turn round. "There's fierce rocks here, sonny," he said. "Now d'ye see yon buoy, the Sarny Bwitch? Well, watch that, and don't let it swing all over the place. Put the wheel the way you want the ship to go, like a car. Now indeed, to goodness, like a car." At these magic words, like a car, old Brum really felt at home, and rapidly became one of the most expert helmsmen. It was with the greatest reluctance that he left the wheel at all, to hand over to Pete, who promptly had the ship heading somewhere towards Peru. But they all got the hang of it in due course, and though her wake was like the tortuous track of an outsized snake, somehow the Warspite wandered on her appointed way towards St. Tudwall's, which buoy came abeam, and course was altered to allow good sea room for passing the causeway well outside. Northwest by north it was, and northwest by north, more or less, they steered. The weather was fine and clear, the breeze light, southwest, and the sea slight. "Too good to last, sir, too good to last," Yank overheard the mate saying to the captain. "Well, we'll use it while we can. We'll tack her and wear her and jibe her round, so the boys will understand what's going on." "Ready about," shouted the captain. "Ready about," echoed the mate. "Ready about," shouted the boys. Again the lads mustered aft, and the captain explained to them in a few clear words just what he was going to do. A sailing ship, he said, could not always go the way she wanted to go, but she could get where she needed to be by beating. That simply meant zigzagging against the wind, first this way and then that, gaining in the desired direction each time until her objective was reached. The process of getting her round from one direction to the other, the zig to the zag, so to speak, was called tacking or wearing, and it meant simply that from sailing as close as possible into the eye of the wind on the one side, she did the same thing as quickly as possible with the wind on the other. She tacked when she was put across the wind right into it, and for that she needed fair speed and good weather. She wore round when the weather was bad, and in that case she ran off before the wind jibed on to the other tack. That is to say, swung the sails across carefully when the wind was behind her, to bring the wind on their other side. It was all quite simple, but it had to be done properly, without doing any damage or putting strains on gear, which it was not designed to accept. First, the captain showed the boys how the ship could make any number of courses, by putting the wheel first one way and letting the ketch run off, easing the sheets of the main and mizzen as the wind drew further and further aft, and then jibing the booms across, letting them go on a controlled run, with the gaffs and the sail swinging from one side to the other, so the wind was on the other side. The boys saw that the ship could sail almost round a circle, but there were a few directions in which the wind made it impossible for her. Unless the sails were reasonably full of wind, they could impart no forward motion to the hull, and when the wind was nearly ahead, the canvas shook so much that the sails were useless. They had gone over all this in lessons on theory of sailing at the school, of course, and they had tacked the cutters and the small yachts in the estuary of the Dovey, when everybody had the hang of what was happening with the ship. As she was put through her paces, the captain said that it was time to go about, to make a board, he called it. The mate stationed the boys, instructing them in their duties. Yank went to the wheel, and glowed with pride to hear the captain say, "That boy has a nice touch with the helm. There must be something in this ocean yacht racing." Tiny Donaldson stood by the back stay, the mate explaining that his was the important job of keeping the mast properly stressed, and his duty was to slack the lee back stay, run across the deck, and set up the stay to windward as the ship came round. Titch Edwards went to the lifts. Hans the Icelander took charge of the boom, tackle on the main, and Chum Jones took the mizzen. Taffy, Brum Shrivenham, Mike Curly Matheson, Pete, and the rest were disposed where they would be of most assistance, and the mate himself went into the bows, taking Don Wiggins with him to look after the head sheets. Then all was ready, and the big ketch boomed along with good way, and all the gear clear for running, every boy at his place. "Lee-o!" shouted the captain, and Yank put the wheel down spoke by spoke to bring the ship into the wind, without losing her way, not slamming the wheel down, but treating it gently, as the bows and the long bowsprit swung towards the open sea with a rush, and the sails began to slat and bang. The boys had been well instructed. The jib sheets were let go when the wind came ahead, and the backed staysail canted the ship's head further until the wind had swung right across the bow and began to take the big sails on what had been their lee side. Over went both booms, over went the head sails. All three of them, sheets and tackles, were set up heartily. Weather backstays and lifts attended to, and in 59 seconds flat, timed by the captain's stopwatch, the big war spite was round and bounding along on the other tack. "Good work, my lads," beamed the captain. 10 minutes on this tack, and see if we can do it again in 45 seconds. So they beat and beat until the warspite was spinning like a top, and every boy was near perfect at his drill, and not only that, understood all that was going on as well as his own part in it. They changed jobs until each felt that he'd a good grasp of the whole thing. Then they wore the ship around, which took more time and lost her some ground, though she came up to the wind again very quickly. Jibing had to be done carefully, lest the main boom took charge and caused damage. Indeed, everything had to be done carefully and properly. That's what a sailing ship is for, and that's why you're here, lads, the captain explained to them. Most countries in Europe and the American Coast Guard keep big barks and ships just for this reason, to bring boys up right in the ways of the sea. You can fool with a steamer perhaps, but things must be done right in any sort of a sailor. You start right if you get the hang of working a ship at sea. Now we'll practice man overboard. Any volunteers? For the boat, I mean. We'll not want anyone to jump overboard. They all volunteered to man the boat, which was carried slung outboard at the davits, always ready. A life buoy was dropped in the water to simulate a buoy, and the ship maneuvered across the wind to take the speed from her, while the boat was lowered with the utmost speed and the buoy picked up again. The morning and half the afternoon sped past without anyone having time even to admire the glorious Welsh scenery. At last the order was belay all, and the ketch was put on her course again for St. Tudwall's Roads, while Curly Matheson and the little Welsh engineer, who'd been busy all day trying to get a lighting set to function properly, disappeared below to get a good stew cooking in the galley. Soon delightful odors of a generous stew came floating up through the skylight, while the islands off the roads danced into closer and closer view. West Island, with a big white lighthouse making it conspicuous, and St. Tudwall's Island to the east. Cape Garnevin will open there, between the point of Wilfa and West Island, was the order to the helmsman as the ketch ran steadily onwards towards St. Tudwall Sound. To young Edwards at the wheel, the cliffs seemed dangerously close, as the ketch ran between them and the rocky island. He could see some seals sunning themselves on the inshore rocks, and the sea was swirling along the base of the high cliffs. The scenery was grand and wild, and the little bay of Abersoch looked most inviting. The mizzen and staysail were run down, the ketch making for her anchorage under main and jib. Mr. Hughes was forward again, looking to the anchor. Aft, the captain stood by the wheel, conning. Once in the Sound, most of the motion went out of the sea, and the ketch ran on in an almost ghostly silence, broken only by the wash of the water on the nearby rocks, and the screeching of the welcoming gulls. Hans the Icelander was sounding with the hand lead, and the Welsh engineer had his head up from the open skylight of his beloved engine-room to admire the view, or perhaps to sniff the stew. An old lifeboat shed on a point came abeam, and a half-3 sung the Icelander at the lead. "Bring her up a point," to the helmsman, from the captain, who motioned with his hand to indicate with certainty the way he wanted the ship to go. A small yellow house peeped out behind the lifeboat shed, and a 3/4 from Hans. "Down helm, stand by to lower the main." A second or two, a great shaking of the sails, the ship coming to an orderly halt in her stride, and then, "Let go, Mr. Mate, let go it is, sir," and the best bower fell into the still water, with a splashing and a running out of cable. "2 shackles in the water, please, Mr. Hughes." "2 shackles in the water, sir." Now the ketch swung head to wind, and the big mainsail was taken in, like the folded wing of a big sea bird. Everything was made ship-shape and orderly. The decks swept and washed down. The riding light made ready, and the boys trooped down below to an enormous meal of glorious stew, washed down by large cups of tea, with slabs of some hearty sort of cake, called afters. At any rate, Curly said it was cake, and it made good ballast. The boys ate together in the saloon, with only one on watch on deck. The captain sat at the head of the starboard table, and the mate at the port, and many were the questions fired at them. How long the boys might have gone on yarning and talking there was no saying, but towards 8 o'clock the captain called a halt. "Now, my lads, to your bunks, except the anchor watch. It'll be a long day tomorrow." "Aye, a long day tomorrow." There was little doubt about that.